We're going to look at some useful text functions. Some of these things can be done using Power Query or other commands, which I'll show you as well. I'll just quickly show you Power Query, but obviously that's very advanced and that's in a different training tutorial. So I have an example here, and we're going to pull it into Power Query by going to Data from Table Range. My table has headers because I've got this name and location here. Okay, so this is very advanced. I'll go through this in a different training program, but I use Power Query quite a lot for my reporting, and it automates reports and it's very powerful. Some of the transform options here are similar to what I'm going to go through in this tutorial. We've got formatting options here, lowercase, uppercase, and this is proper case. We can trim to get rid of any gaps. And there's also add prefix, add suffix. We've got split column by delimiter, but there's various other options here. And replace values. So here are our applied steps. Whatever transformations we make here, we can use again. So whenever our data changes, we can just refresh and it will go through these applied steps. So at the moment, Excel's already done this for us. The source is that it took a table from the current workbook. That's just this data here. And the change type was that it made this text. Before, it didn't know if it was text or numerical data. It recognized that it was text, so it's changed it there. I can then add some more steps. I could then say I want to format this column, I've got that column highlighted, into uppercase. I could also split it by delimiter. So I've got my first name and surname. And it's recognised the space. There's other options here. OK. I can go to here and I want to replace UK with GB and GE for Germany to DE. So I can go to replace values. I have to do them one at a time. Find UK, replace with GB. OK. So you can see here, we're getting our applied steps here. I'll go through them at the end. And the next one, replace value, GE with DE. So to clean those up, I can then just amend that to first name, surname. And then we have our applied steps. Originally it was in proper case. Over here I changed it to uppercase, that's that step there. Then I split the column by delimiter, so we've got our first name and surname. Excel automatically adds another change type step. I could actually delete it if I wanted to. So we've got these red crosses here where we can just delete anything. So now we wanted to replace UK with GB, which was this step here. So before it was like that. Now it's GB. And then the second one, the GE to DE, and that's been cleaned there. And then if you just look at the headers, I rename the columns. So any new data we get added to this, we can just press the refresh button and it's going to apply all these steps to that new data as well. So let's just go home, close and load. This is our original data on this tab here, and it's going to open up a new tab. I'm just going to get rid of the formatting. There we go. So we've got our first name, surname. We added those columns ourselves. It's in uppercase, and this is now GB rather than UK, and this is DE rather than GE. If we go back to our original data, I can copy and paste this data here, over here. This is now part of our table. You see it's now formatted the same. We've got the blue tick here, extending that range. So if I go back to this tab here with our cleaned data, I can press refresh all. And it's applied those steps to those new names. So if we just go back here, they were here, proper case, UK, GE. Now that uppercase, we split between the first and surname, and it's changed UK to GB and GE to DE. So you can see that Power Query is very useful. It's not just in the table range. You could have different files or even in a folder. So when you press refresh, if you've got data there, it can pull in that and go through all those steps. Obviously more complicated than what we've done. It's a very powerful tool. But again, that's advanced and that's in another session. So let's go back to our Excel and how we can do those transformations, but with formulas. So here I've written the company name, Coraline Data Services. You can see here it's a mixture of case. Obviously, I either want it all in lowercase, uppercase, or with each word capitalized. So here we can use upper, lower, and proper. I'm just going to write it again for you. Equals upper, and I just select that cell, and it puts it all in uppercase. Equals lower, select the original, it's all in lowercase, and equals proper. I'm going to go through these quite quickly because I think it's fairly simple. And this is probably what you would normally want. So there are different options. Sometimes I've put too many in here, but sometimes you can have trailing spaces or leading spaces, and you don't want those. You want to get rid of these extra spaces. So you can use something called trim, equals trim. And there we go, no gaps. If I've got something here where I've got a mixture of case and I've got all these gaps, I can wrap my trim function around one of my case functions. So here I can write equals proper, and let's wrap that in trim. So this should capitalize each word and get rid of the gaps. There we go. If you didn't know if there were gaps or not, there's no harm in wrapping it in trim anyway. And there's a function called len for length. So if you want to know the length of characters, equals len. This is normally something I'd use inside another function. It's 9 characters long. And here you can extract the left, right, or the middle part of your word. In this instance, it isn't very useful because you have to know how many characters each of your words is for this to actually work. But I do sometimes use left and right if I want to extract the first or last part of a cell. And we can use the delimiter. And also, this used to be quite complicated, but Excel have brought out some new functions called TextBefore and TextAfter. And also on the data tab here, we have text to columns. But let's just show you left and right. So equals left, text, number of characters. Well, I already worked that one out here, so I can actually just say 9. And it brings me back this. And again, this isn't very useful because I have to know how many characters are in it, but I could say equals right, text, number of characters, 8. And to get the middle part, I'd have to do equals mid this. My start number, I could take my 9, but I need to add 2 to account for the gap, and then we're starting here, so I'm adding 2, so that's 11, and the number of characters is 4. So that's how that works. But if I just copy and paste that over here, and here I'm going to do text to columns, delimited, space, next, finish. That's what you're more likely to use. And these new functions equals text, text before, our original data here. The delimiter is a space. I need to put it in quotation marks. Instance number 1. So text before this first space equals text after, text, delimiter, space in quotation marks, instance 2. So after the second, it will return what's left. To get the middle, you could say equals text before this text, delimiter, space, instance number 2. Let's just close it there and see what that does. Then we can wrap it in text after. So this brings us both, because we use the second instance, we said text before the second space, and then we could wrap that in text after. There's probably other ways of doing this, and obviously the text to columns is probably the best way to do it. So we're wrapping it in text after. So this is our text, our delimiter is space in quotation marks, and the first instance. So remember, underneath this, our main part of the formula, the text before, brought back Coralline data. So we're saying from Coralline data, we want the text after the first space. So that's going to be data. There we go. But if we just go back over here and do our text to columns, delimited, space, finish. So that's probably the best way. You may already have your data like this and you want it all in one cell. There are two options, equals text join, and we're just going to have a space as our delimiter. So when it joins them together, what delimiter is going to go in between each word? A space. Ignore emptied cells, true. And text 1, text 2, text 3. So it's text 1, text 2, text 3. It's all in one cell. And concat does the same. Equals concat. And here it's slightly harder. It's okay if you don't want any delimiters. You could say text 1, text 2, text 3. Otherwise, you're going to have to put in here text 2 is space, and in here space, comma, to get your result. And just another option here was the text split. So equals text split text space as the delimiter. So that does the same as your text to columns. It is in this, it's an array function, so it brings the result back to here and it spills into these two cells. You can see the formulas there. If I click in the next cell here, it's grayed out. If you want to hard key these into the cells rather than have that formula, you can highlight this. When your cursor is the double arrows, right click, drag away, drag back on top of itself, release the mouse, copy here as values only. Then you've got your results there. So before these new text options came in, if you didn't know how to use Power Query, I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom and show you. If you wanted to have a dynamic way of splitting words out, you'd have to use quite complicated formulas. So you'd have equals left of the original word, find the delimiter, because if you had a list of different names and they were different length of characters, you couldn't just type the number in. You couldn't just say A73, 8 letters, because I know it's 8 letters long. You'd have to use find the delimiter. So that would be how you'd pull in the first word. And then from the middle part of the word, you'd have to know the length of your first word and make these adjustments. And search is the same as find. They pretty much do the same. I'm going to go through those. Search for the delimiter. And we've got all of this here. It's quite complicated. And then to get the last part, you could do a right formula. And again, using the length of these two that you've worked out and then pull it in. So this was very complicated, and a while ago I was doing it this way because those other functions didn't exist, and that was before I started using Power Query. So it was very complicated. Let me just go back through a few more simpler ones and we'll go through find and search there. So in our example in Power Query, we did a replace to replace UK with GB. There's two functions here you can use, either substitute or replace. They pretty much do the same thing. Just going to copy and paste this over here and we'll do it from scratch. Equals substitute this, the old text. I've got it written in this cell here, so I'm just going to use that cell as my old text, and I'm going to have to absolute reference that by pressing F4 to get our dollar signs, because if I drag this down I always want to be referring to that cell B35, and the new text is this here. Again, F4. And I actually don't need that instance number, so just close that bracket. So replace old text, that's this here, start number 1, number of characters 2, new text. So I could either reference this cell, or I could just actually put in quotation marks here, GB. There are our results. And here I did it where I actually just selected that cell there. That's probably a better way of doing it, because if we changed our mind, we could just change it in this cell here. And it changes all of these. Otherwise, we just have to amend our formula. 88. And drag it down. In one of my basics videos, I do go over find and replace here. So I could have selected this, replace, find, UK, replace with GB. They made 6 replacements. You just have to be sure that you selected this, because we did have the word UK written over here, so it could be that we replaced everything that happened to have the UK in it with GB. So just make sure when you see that we've made replacements, how many there are. This probably won't happen very often, but just in case you use trim and it doesn't work, it's probably because the gap in your word or in your text isn't a spacebar space, it's just some blank space. It's referred to as non-breaking space. Sometimes if I'm downloading data from some system or a website, it comes back as a non-breaking space rather than when I'm typing text and I'm adding a spacebar space. If I want to do a lookup or a match on these two cells here, if we eyeball that data, they look the same, but when I do a formula, it doesn't think they're a match. This could lead to some errors if I'm doing a lookup or index and match on a large amount of data. It might not find the answer when really it's because our data isn't cleaned properly. A normal trim wouldn't work. Here we've trimmed this. It's hard for us to see. It didn't actually trim this properly because this wasn't a normal spacebar space. It was a non-breaking space. So I've got the same here where it's a non-breaking space. So for this example, I've had to add substitute. Just before I go into it, Excel gives characters a number. A non-breaking space is character 160, a spacebar space is 32. So we could say, if we have a non-breaking space, let's substitute that and replace it with this, 32. Then we could do our trim because our trim works on the spacebar space. So inside our function, the first part of the function would be to substitute our text, our original text, where there's a non-breaking space, that's the old text, replace it with a spacebar space, character 32, and then we wrap it in trim. So don't worry if you don't understand that or you're not going to remember it. You could just use this to refer back to in case you ever come across an instance where you've extracted some data and the trim doesn't work. You would just need to use this instead. You can maybe save that somewhere if you know you're going to have that issue. So find and search. I don't really use these on their own. It was something that I might use for something like this. So I could say find a space in this and it will return the character number. So I know my name is Michelle with 8 characters long. The space is the 9th character. Search does the same. If we write them from scratch, equals find text, space, or it could be a delimiter like a comma or a certain word within, that's this, within this text, and start number 1. And search is exactly the same, equals search, find text, that's our space, within text, our original text here, start number 1. So they're both the same really. I probably use find. So here I've used find to find the @ symbol in these email addresses. And it's found it in this one at position 14 and in this one position 9. So if I want to extract my name or the first part of the email, I could say equals left and this cell here, and then refer to this cell here, the number of characters, that's 14, and I just make an adjustment of 1 because 14 will include that @ symbol. So I want 13, I want to extract the first 13 characters just to pull back my name. And that's dynamic because we're not specifying the actual characters. Remember up here where it wasn't very helpful, where I had to actually specify the number. But obviously with different names or different words, they're going to have different character lengths. So that's how you can use left and find together. For this, I actually wrote find over here and then refer to that cell in this formula here, left, then refer to my cell that had find in it. But obviously I could write it in one formula instead. My find formula was in B68. So rather than reference cell B68, I could have just written the find formula there and then done that -1 adjustment. So at first when you're doing formulas, you can just do them in different cells like here. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way, but it might just be more efficient to write it all in one. But in the beginning, it's probably good to write it like that. Then you realise you can just copy and paste that across that B68 there, as you can see there. And then here we can extract the last part of the email by using our write. And we're looking up these here And then we're saying we want the length of the whole word minus this. So the length of all of this minus where the @ symbol is will bring us these characters on the right here. So that's just to show you find and search, but you probably wouldn't have to use them that often, as we now have those new text before, text after, we've got split by delimiter and various other options now. So just so you know that they're there in case you ever need them, or you inherit other people's data and they've used those formulas and you don't really know what they are.